Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and please take a seat. And thank you very much for coming to St. Ebbe's this evening. It's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us for this special event. And a really warm welcome to Bob White, who is our speaker this evening. Professor Bob White is a distinguished scientist. He is Emeritus Professor of Geophysics at University of Cambridge. He is also the co-founder of the Faraday Institute for Religion and Science. And their website is a very rich resource on issues to do with science and with Christianity. Bob himself has written and published extensively on these areas. He's a geologist by training. His favorite volcano, because he specializes in volcanoes and earthquakes, is in Iceland, and he'll happily talk to you about that later on. But tonight, he is here to speak about the environmental crisis and Christian hope. So I'm going to hand over to Bob. He will speak, then we'll have a little break for a few minutes, and then there'll be time for a Q&A, and we'll aim to finish around 9 o'clock. But Bob, really warm welcome to you, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I know there is a crisis in environment, and there's two things I should say. Sometimes people talk about the environment as if it's something different from us, but of course it's not. We're part of it. As I think Augustine said, that nature is what God does. So we're part of that, aren't we? And I know quite a lot of young people, at least that I come across, students, are really worried about what might happen to the earth. And I have to say that Christians should have a very different perspective on that, because we believe in a creator God, we believe in a sovereign God who has a long-term plan for the future of this earth. And I hope I'll bring out some of that in this talk. But I thought I'd spend the first part of it just talking about some of the facts of what's going on, mostly in climate change. And probably you know this stuff, but it's quite nice to see it. And then I'll talk about a Christian perspective on this and the specific hope that Christians have for this material world, because the new creation is going to be an embodied place where we'll have bodies. So you know these things. 19 of the last 20 years are the hottest on record. There's been about a 1 degree C rise in temperature globally since pre-industrial times, which doesn't sound very much if you live in England, because it's quite nice to have hot summers. Not maybe 40 degrees, but nice warm summers are good. But when you think the difference between an ice age and a normal temperate period that we're in now is only 5 or 6 or 7 degrees, 1 degree is quite a significant chunk of that. And it's going to go up more. We've already committed the Earth to that. But the real issue is the rate at which temperature is changing, which is really hard for people to cope with. So if you live in Bangladesh, where 30 million people live within 1 meter of sea level, and sea level rises by 1 meter, then you lose your livelihood, you lose your home. And in the days before nation states, well, you just maybe migrated inland a bit. But we all know how important borders of countries are now. And I guess we all know how refugees are treated. Not very well, I have to say, in most cases. So the rate of change of temperature is a really big issue, certainly for humans to cope with, let alone the rest of animals and so on. So let's just look for the last 1,000 years, see what temperature has done. It goes plus or minus, down to minus 1 degree up to about 0.8. And basically not much changed until the Industrial Revolution, and then it shot up. Now, I drew this graph a few years ago. I think it's in the book at the back, actually, and I realized I had to update it now, so that's what it's done since about 2010, I think it was, when I drew that. We've gone up about 1 degree. Let's look at the past 160,000 years, and the reason for that time is this is one period of an ice age and a temperate period in between. Over the last few million years, the Earth has got into a cycle of having an ice age every 120,000, 160,000 years. And we understand why. It's changes in the cycle, in the way that the Earth orbits the Sun, makes it sometimes hotter, sometimes cooler. So it's nothing unusual about that. But the bit I've circled in red is the last 10,000 years since the end of the last ice age. And you'll see there's been an incredibly stable temperature. It's not varied. And this is the whole period where there's been a blossoming of human culture. You could have settled agriculture, because next year the climate's going to be much the same as it was last year and this year. And you can have herds and so on. So really, that stability has been crucial to the whole human flourishing, actually, over those past 10,000 years since the end of the last ice age. But what I'm going to do now is put carbon dioxide over the same timescale in red, and you can see that pretty well it mirrors what the temperature has done. When the temperature is high, carbon dioxide is high, temperature's low, carbon dioxide is low. And you can see what we've done now. We've gone up to, I just checked today, 419 parts per million, which doesn't sound much, but it should be about 270 parts per million. And we've gone way outside anything humans have ever experienced, indeed anything the Earth has experienced for the past several million years. And if we carry on as we are now, it's going to go up to that red line at the top of the graph. And you don't have to be a very sophisticated scientist to know that when they're that closely coupled between temperature and carbon dioxide, if carbon dioxide goes up, it's going to get hotter. And in fact, we've known this for 150 years. It's been well understood. So that's not a new understanding. The precise details of how it will interact with the Earth is more complicated, but the baseline, what it's doing, is pretty clear. Well, let's go back several ice ages now. We can go back 4 ice ages, or maybe it's 3, and you can do that by drilling an ice core. Way back. You can date it because there's annual changes in snowfall, and you just count the layers like you would count tree rings. So we can date pretty well as you go back, and you can tell what the temperature was by looking at different oxygen isotopes because they fractionate differently. So by looking at those bubbles, you can tell the carbon dioxide concentration, methane concentration, temperature. So what I'm going to do is plot those 3 on this graph through the last 3 ice ages, I think, and just watch how they're correlated. They all go up and down together. When they go down, they all go down. When they go up, they all go up. So temperature is coupled to carbon dioxide and methane, and you can see the ice ages dominate, and the warm bits are when that red line is high. So what we've done in the past 50 years or so with carbon dioxide, I showed you just now, it's gone up like that. Methane's gone up even more to 1,800 parts per billion. And that matters because methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. So that's what we're doing to the Earth. That's the driver for everything at the moment. Well, there has been debate whether the temperature changes are due to human activity. I think that every year that goes by, it becomes clearer and clearer that it is due to humans, and it's hard to maintain otherwise. I'm going to talk about the IPCC, which is a very authoritative body that issues reports on the climate every 4 years or so. Been going since 1988, and I'll explain why, because it was driven by a child of Oxford, I have to say, and they're really careful about the words they use, and this is approved by all the governments of the world. It's actually the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they started off in the 1990s by saying it was likely that humans were causing changes to the climate, and then it became very likely, and the last report, which was just published a year or so ago, they said it's unequivocal. Now this is massive, hundreds of climate scientists from all over the world coming together, agreeing with governmental representatives. So not much doubt that humans are causing the problem. And I can't help showing a picture of my favorite volcano, which, did you pronounce it? You didn't, did you? You see, it's Bardabunga. The one that stopped all the aeroplanes was called, anybody remember that, in 2010? You maybe got stuck on holiday in the Canaries, some people did. Eyjafjallajökull, which is my other favorite one. But this is the one that came from Bardabunga in 2014, and I was fortunate enough to be there. This is just taken on my iPhone. Those fire fountains are 300 foot high, and the lava was flowing towards us, so I didn't stay long. But and it's just amazing. I've switched the sound off, but actually these are jet engines. You see it on television, you don't realize how noisy eruptions like this are. They're literally jet engine noises. But I wanted to draw attention to the brown stuff. Can you see that going across in the sky? That is sulfur dioxide. And this was producing 30,000 tons of sulfur dioxide every day, more than the whole of the European Union. And sulfur dioxide is one of those gases which actually causes cooling. So volcanic effects cause temporary cooling, and that's been well understood and seen in the world, especially when Krakatoa erupted. So there are natural variations. Sulfur dioxide is one of them. It also produces carbon dioxide as well, by the way. Sorry, I couldn't resist showing you what I do. I used to be paid to do that. I can't believe how lucky I was, but I've now retired, so I can still do it, but they don't pay me anymore. Although I have a nice pension, so it's okay. So, actually, I should say this to people who are postdocs, being emeritus is like being a postdoc again, because you get to do all the things that are fun in research without having to do all the bureaucracy and the teaching and the forms. So look forward to it. It's a little way away yet, but for most of you. So here's a graph which is from lots of climate models to show you the simulated natural variations along the bottom, and then the observed is the black line, and the best model of the observed is that sort of brownish line. And they don't match exactly, but they do a pretty good job, and it's pretty clear that most of that change of about 1 degree is due to human factors, not to natural factors like volcanoes and El Nino and La Nina. In fact, we've been through a period where temperatures have probably been suppressed by those ocean currents, El Nino and La Nina, and will probably, when that stops, it will accelerate again. What causes global warming? The one we all know about is carbon dioxide. That's about 2/3 of the responsible gas. Methane is about 1/4, even though it's much smaller quantities because it is so much more powerful. And there are some other things like nitrous oxide and chlorofluorocarbons which contribute as well. So one of the fascinating things about climate change is that you get more methane because you get more rainfall, you get more swamps, more beavers and so on, which produces more methane. But another thing is a human factor. I'll come to you in a minute. Production of greenhouse gases, although we all think air travel is horrible, well, perhaps we don't think it's horrible, but we think it produces a lot of greenhouse gases. It's responsible for about 3% of the greenhouse gases. And that's about the same as all the Google searches we do, right? That uses about 3% of the world's energy to do a Google search, partly because they send it to 2 different servers to get a response back quickly, because we're so impatient to get the response. So, you know, you have to keep things in balance. The other thing is that cows produce a lot of methane from both ends, and they're responsible for a huge amount of global warming, about 18 to 20% of global warming. And there's about 1.5 billion cows in the world. So that's a real problem. And that's why people say being vegetarian is certainly helpful. I mean, there's also the fact that it takes 7 kilograms of vegetable protein to make 1 kilogram of cow protein. And it takes a lot of water, and you chop down the rainforest and so on. So the fact when people get rich, they want to eat more meat, it's not necessarily very good for the planet, and it's probably not very good for them too. New Zealand, which produces a huge amount of red meat, actually they have one of the highest instances of heart disease in the world. So, yeah, I'm not vegetarian, but I certainly eat more vegetarian food than I used to. So cows. Actually, I once said this in an audience, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, well, I'm president of Send a Cow Charity. Have you heard of Send a Cow Charity? It's a really good charity. They send a milking cow to people in Africa, and it provides a livelihood, right? Because they produce milk and they've got a cow and so on. Maybe that's of a different order to massive farming for beef. And this has really shown up. If you look at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, the brown circle is wild animals. The little blue circle you can't see is the mass of people. But if we look today, people have got a lot more. So that's the blue circle. But the animals that we farm to eat, cattle and sheep and pigs and so on, is even more mass. And wild animals have shrunk. Even the animals we keep for playthings, really, for recreation, dogs and cats and horses and so on, are about the same mass as all the wild animals in the world. So we have to think about how we live, don't we? This has a big impact, everything we do. Now, I want to show you this because a lot of people will say, well, I'm only little old me, what can I do about global climate change? And the point of this is carbon dioxide going through a year where the deeper the red, the higher the carbon dioxide concentration. It's actually for 2006, but it would be the same today, except the colors would all be more red. And the black colors are carbon monoxide. So we're in spring here, so the northern hemisphere is beginning to grow and you're getting much more carbon dioxide around. And southern hemisphere is winter, carbon monoxide. And the point I want to make is that what you do affects everybody else in the world. So if you've got a patio heater burning methane, burning gas, bottled gas, those gases go right around the world really quite quickly. So what we do does affect everybody else in the world in a very direct way. And actually, this is mesmerizing. I could watch it all evening. So we're just come up to where we are today, and it will get much redder yet from this in the northern hemisphere. Anyway, just to make that point, that what we do does affect other people. And climate change causes more extreme weather events, be they floods. Well, it may not cause more weather events, but when they happen, they're more extreme because there's a lot of energy in water vapor. And the thing that kills most people in the world from disasters, what we call natural disasters, though actually a book I've written shows mostly it's due to human factors, are not earthquakes, they're not volcanoes, they're something as mundane as floods. Floods even kill people in Britain, don't they? Every year a few people die in floods. And last year 1,700 people died in Pakistan from floods, which were forecast a week ahead. They knew it was coming, the water was coming down, and yet they still died. So floods kill people, and climate change causes much worse floods, also causes worse droughts. And droughts lead to famines, and if you live in sub-Saharan Africa and your crops don't grow because there's been a drought, you can maybe manage for a year or 2 years, but by the third year, you're probably going to get ill. Quite likely you'll die. Now, it's hard to tell. People are malnourished and they die from maybe other diseases, but actually the root cause in those cases would be climate change still. They cause wildfires. We see that on the TV all the time. The sea ice is melting in the Arctic, so in the last 40 years, covered here, 3.5 million square kilometres are melted. That's 14 times the area of the UK. It's just going down and down and down. And this is quite a busy graph, but the bottom one is projections of what sea ice will do. I just showed you 40 years from 1980 to 2020. Projections going forward with the best climate models show that it'll likely be ice-free in the Arctic. The top one is temperature changes. And you know that we're trying to keep temperatures to 1.5 or 2 degrees. Well, everything we're doing now is in those red zones at the top. These are different scenarios for how people behave. And people are still burning a lot of fossil fuels. And it's going to be really hard to keep down, but you have to work hard at it. So the bottom ones are really drastic, but they still you don't go straight back to zero because there's so much heat embodied in the oceans and so on. So Arctic ice, I brought that example up because when you've got ice, it reflects light. If it melts, the water absorbs heat, and the temperature changes already in the Arctic are about 4 or 5 degrees, where globally it's about 1 degree. So massive changes already being caused. And of course, we've got one planet, it's spaceship Earth, that's what we live on. But at the moment, we're using resources of about 3.5 worlds. And that's obviously unsustainable. Well, the last point in this sort of factual bit is that a comment that Ban Ki-moon made, who's Secretary General of the UN, some years ago now. This is 14 years ago, isn't it? Climate change affects us all, but unfortunately, not evenly, not equally. Those most likely to suffer first and foremost from the effects of climate change are the poor people and the disadvantaged people and the people in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. In other words, not the people who cause the problem, who are us, the rich people, but the people who suffer are the people elsewhere. And this is a real ethical and moral issue, and one that I think Christians should be deeply concerned about and actually engaged in, because a lot of Christians have connections with those poorer areas of the majority world, through missionary work or through aid work, medical aid work or educational aid work. Okay, so let's think of a few Christian perspectives. The first point really is obvious, so obvious it hardly needs saying, but when God created the world, he said it was good, 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 it was good. The very first chapter of Genesis. If you like, this is his mission statement, isn't it? It's the very first thing you read. And then when he created humans and saw everything he'd made, he said it was very good. So you can't get away from that. I often say that Christianity is a very materialistic religion. It's very it's based on materialistic things, material things, the material world. And the material world, God said, was very good and is very good because he made it that way. So I think we have to remember that. Another way of saying good is that it's fit for purpose, fit for his purpose. Now, it's not an easy world to live in. There are hazards and so on. But humans can cope with that, or they should be able to. And I really believe that it's a sign of God's goodness to us that he's made a world which is understandable by us, right, by science, that we can make sense of what's happening, including climate change, but other things too. The very fact we can do science, it might not have been that way, but God has made a world that way. I think it's part of his general grace to us as people that he's made a world that's understandable. Now, of course, you can use that understanding for good or for evil purposes, but at least it is a consistent, coherent world that we can understand. And many scientists through the ages have used this as the basis for their work. Many of the scientists that are listed here, these were all very keen Christians. The Royal Society was founded by a group of very keen Christians, evangelical Christians mostly, who wanted to use their understanding of the world for the common good. That's what's in their charter, for the good of humankind and for the glory of God, they said, actually. So all these people, if anybody tells you can't be a Christian and a scientist, it's nonsense, because historically, and even today, there are many Christians who have a vocation to work because they're studying God's world. And I always think, it's wonderful that I was paid to study God's creation as my profession. It's a great job. And the other thing to say is this actually is written in Japanese and French at the top, because I've given a similar talk in those countries. And science is truly international. I think it's one of those things that does reach across borders, because our understanding of scientific understanding is consistent, whatever your creed or nationality. And I think that's a huge advantage. Even during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, there were connections between Western scientists and Eastern and Soviet scientists. Maybe things are a bit different at the moment, because a lot of scientific societies have cut themselves off from Russia for Ukrainian reasons. But I want to underline this, and I want to talk about one Christian who came from Oxford at the end, who had an enormous significance globally by the work he did. And then that scientific understanding enables us actually to deal with things like climate change. You can't see the axes, but this is the cost of onshore wind. It's dropped to 20% of what it was just a few decades ago. Solar generation is the same. So it's actually cheaper now to generate electricity from renewable sources than it is from hydrocarbons. And that's part of the common grace of scientific understanding, I think. So that's one thing. God created a world which is understandable, can be used for the common good. God sustains the universe. We have to remember that he is sovereign over it, and he's sustaining it in this way, which is consistent and understandable for us to work in. So just a couple of comments from Hebrews 1, Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, sustaining all things by his powerful word, he said. Similarly, the Apostle Paul said, for by Jesus all things were created, in him all things hold together. So that's the sort of picture we have of the world according to the Bible. It's not a world where God set it going and then went away and left it to its own purposes. That's called deism. We have a God who's intimately involved in his world. He's immanent in it. He's upholding it for a place where we can live. And of course we can mess up. And if we mess up, we suffer the consequences. It doesn't stop God loving us, doesn't stop him being sovereign, but we suffer the consequences. And of course we all understand that in the system of justice. If you've done something wicked and you get put in prison, even if you're a Christian and repent, you'll still have to go to prison and serve the consequences of what you've done. And that's what we're facing now. And I just want to make a little point. Sometimes we think humans are the most important thing. Well, they are important. We're made in God's image, the only animal that is. Psalm 8 says, we're just a little lower than the angels. But also, God loves his whole creation, right? He waters a land, and he makes a point of saying in Job, where no man lives, no person lives. A desert with no one in it to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass. God loves all of his creation, and I think we can sometimes think we're the only thing that matters in God's creation, and clearly we're not. And we should be looking after something that he delights in and loves. And in fact, it was the very first commandment he gave us in Genesis 1:28. If you remember that, God blessed Adam and Eve and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Some people have said this is a sign of the stewardship we should be having. I think it is actually a bit stronger than stewardship. The earth needs a bit of strong control. If you want to grow nice vegetables, you've got to remove the weeds from where you're growing the vegetables. So it's not just being rather wishy-washy and nice to it. You've got to have dominion over it. That is the word used here. But we know how we should behave towards the world because Jesus modeled it for us, didn't he? He ruled as a servant king. He was sovereign, and yet he was a servant to people. And what this very first commandment is telling us is that we should be ruling on God's behalf on the earth in the same way as servants of him. And we know that in the new creation we will rule with him. And I've put this in from Luke, something Jesus said, from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. From the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. Because I know we sometimes think we're having a pretty tough time, because we've got exams next month, or things are tough here because my bicycle broke down and the price of petrol is so high and so on. But actually we're the ones who have been given much, both materially and with the gospel. So much will be demanded. And I think it's a sobering thought, isn't it? From the one who's been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. So I think our Christian response should certainly encompass that, particularly given that scientific fact that climate change was caused largely by us and other rich nations burning fossil fuels. We burnt more coal in the Industrial Revolution than all the oil in Saudi Arabia. That's what our wealth was built on. What about hope for the future? That was in the title, wasn't it? And it is important because we do have a hope of a new creation where if you're a Christian believer, you will dwell with Christ. We don't know a lot about it, but we know enough about it. So in Revelation, we read that John saw a new heaven and a new earth where there's no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, I'm making everything new. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? He didn't say, I'm making all new things. He said, I'm renewing things. He's going to make them renewed. And we're not going to float off and play harps on clouds somewhere. We're going to be embodied people, and Christ is going to come down and live with us. That's the way what the Bible says. So there is a place for this world. Now, we don't know what it will be like. The only person that's come back from heaven, if you like, from the new creation as Jesus, and he had a body that could walk through walls and appear in a different place instantaneously. Maybe it'd be like that, I don't know. But we will be recognizable people with places to live that really suit us. There'll be many mansions, said Jesus, in his Father's house. Actually, the idea that you can walk through walls doesn't seem so strange when you think about quantum mechanics, where the actual matter is like 1%. Most of this table is empty space, and most of the chairs and so on. So I don't know what the physics will be like, but it's not so surprising. So what else do we know about this new creation? The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there'll be no night there. Nights when nasty things happen. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. And I love this because all the best things of this earth, evidently, will have a representation, will have some continuation into the new creation. So I'm sure there'll be great music. I mean, personally, I think there'll be great volcanic eruptions, and there'll be great visual sights, and they won't hurt anybody. But there'll be great art, there'll be all sorts of things. It says it twice, doesn't it? The kings of the earth will bring their splendor, the glory and honor of the nations will be there. So, I mean, this is definitely something to look forward to. And remember, Jesus said at one point, the kingdom of heaven is here already, it's close to you. Not in all its fullness, but we've seen signs of it. And actually, I think many of us just have those, I don't know what you call them, mountaintop experiences or spiritual experiences where you just have this feeling of rightness. I know I felt that under the stars on the top of La Reunion, where there was a volcano erupting and there was amazing stars up in the sky, and I've seen it with Northern Lights in Iceland, the same. But for some people it might be, sublime music or wonderful art. Glory, there's some continuity. There is discontinuity because there's no more sin, no more crying or mourning, no more death. But there will be some of the best things of human creativity, which presumably we get from God's creativity, will carry through. I think you probably had a sermon on this, or you had a meeting on this on Sunday. The day of the Lord will come like a thief. The earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. Or that's a new NIV version. King James Version says burned up. ESV says exposed. NRSV says disclosed. And I think some people have taken, if they grew up with the King James Version, that it's all going to be burned up, so we don't need to bother about it. But actually the sense of it, the real sense of this verse that Peter was saying, is that the earth will be stripped clean of all sinfulness and all that's wrong. It will be laid bare, be exposed, be disclosed. And it's interesting that this passage comes just after a passage about the flood, which did exactly that. It swept sin off the earth and had a new start. And I think that's the picture that he's trying to give here, that the new creation will be the place God always meant it to be, where we'll be at home, there'll be no more sin, no more death, no more things that we struggle with all the time. And of course, God did make this promise after Noah's flood. I've set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. He said that. Actually, I took this photo in the Lake District, and one thing I didn't notice till I got home and looked at it is, do you see under the rainbow, it's lighter, it's brighter than outside the rainbow? Well, I could tell you the physics of that is because it's double refraction inside the water drops and so on. But I think it's a great picture, isn't it? You're under God's rainbow, this promise, and you're in the light. I think it's a wonderful picture. Just like many things in the Bible, it's just a wonderful picture of how it should be. And of course, creation is waiting in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. It's longing for this new creation when Christ returns, because the whole creation is groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time, said Paul in Romans. And I've been privileged to be with my wife when our two children were born, and I know childbirth is extremely painful, though I haven't experienced it myself, but I've seen it. And I know also the joy that follows the birth of a child, where that is all forgotten. Well, maybe it's not forgotten for some women. I shouldn't speak on behalf of women, should I? But the joy that follows a new birth is immense compared to the pain. And this is what creation is doing. The trees are longing to clap their hands. They're longing to be set free from the imposition of humans, making things not what they should be, not how God meant it to be. Karl Barth, a theologian, in his epistle to the Romans, said, "Without hope there's no freedom but only imprisonment, no grace but only condemnation and corruption, no divine guidance but only fate, no God but only a mirror of unredeemed humanity." We've just made things in our own image. I think that's a very helpful way of looking at it, that the Christian hope is immense. And of course, the Christian hope is based on the resurrection of Jesus. That's the proof of it. Francis Collins, who headed up the National Institute of Health in the US during the COVID crisis and for many years before it, said this. He said, "The only thing that spreads faster than a virus is hope." He's a lovely Christian man, a delightful man, heading up the biggest scientific organization in the world. I think we should give thanks to God that we have Christians in those sort of positions. Luther is reputed to have said, "If I knew Jesus would return tomorrow, I'd plant a tree today." He was picking up on that fact that we should be looking after the world now in the way that we expect to for all eternity. And C.S. Lewis, you can't claim him all for yourself in Oxford because he was in Cambridge as well, but I think he spent more time in Oxford, didn't he? "The Christians who did most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. Aim at heaven and you get earth thrown in," he said. "Aim at earth and you get neither." This is a distinctive Christian approach, isn't it, to care for the world, which our secular world hasn't got. Our secular world hasn't got that hope. It can only say, "Oh, it's terrible. How can we persuade people to change?" We have got that change. And I often finish talks with this because I love it, from Job, who was able to write in the midst of his despair from having lost everything, "I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. Though worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God." He said, Job, one of the oldest books in the Bible probably, long before Christ came, set to music by Messiah, of course. But what I love is that what comes next was a piece from the Old Testament, from the New Testament. "For now is Christ risen from the dead, the first fruits of them that sleep." That is the proof of it. The fact that Jesus has risen from the dead is a proof, as we know from Easter, that this new creation is a reality and that the same is waiting for us. Well, the very last thing I just want to spend a couple of minutes on this, because I think it's an encouragement to see how Christians who are scientists have affected the world in ways that most people don't realize. I've already given the game away about what the IPCC is. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it produces these authoritative reports every 4 years, and it's now up to the 6th one from 1988 when it started. Hundreds and hundreds of scientists, thousands of papers, but the fact it's intergovernmental means that their plenary meetings where they agree their texts, they invite anybody from any country to come. So during these meetings, you usually get a delegation of lawyers from Saudi Arabia trying to downplay what you're trying to say, and you get representatives with all sorts of different agendas trying to agree, and there's no voting mechanism. It's just by consensus, so it's not even just a majority vote. And the person I want to talk about, because he helped set this up, is Sir John Houghton, who died a couple of years ago, who was from Oxford. He was a professor here, head of the Met Office, and then helped set up the IPCC in 1988. This is him on the left receiving the Japan Prize, which is equivalent to a Nobel Prize. He also actually received the Nobel Prize on behalf of the IPCC as well. And that's him on the right in his home in Wales, his great Welshman. But a lovely Christian man. And I've talked to him about the IPCC process. And the thing he insisted on, he was chairing, one of the first co-chairs of the physical science reports in 1988. And he insisted on the truth being in the reports and in their consensus. And this came from his Christian background. He would pray with a group of Christians before each meeting. And some of those meetings went on hours after the closing time. One of them, the janitors had closed the meeting, and they sat there almost in the dark until they got consensus, I think at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning. From all these naysayers, they got a consensus, and this is how these reports have come to be so authoritative, because all the governments of the world have signed up to them, And he insisted from his Christian perspective on only putting truth, not cutting corners. And I think that was an immense contribution to the world, because the IPCC now, those reports are really not argued against. They are the evidence for what's happening. The arguments all happen in the COP meetings, the committees of parties, I think they're called. We had one in Glasgow last year, one in Egypt this year, COP27 this last year. And that's where the political argument goes, well, what should we do about this? How should we agree what to do? But the actual evidence is there in the IPCC reports. And I think we should give thanks. Not many people know his name, know what he did even. But he had a huge influence globally on making these IPCC reports so influential, so authoritative, because they contain the truth. And I was privileged to write a short biography of him, which we've got here, and you can pick some up for free at the back. It was written for the Royal Society. They publish a biography of every fellow after they've died. And the Royal Society, some people think, is very anti-religion. So a lot of this, if you're a physicist here, or if you're anybody, actually just out of interest, it tells you about his life and how he went through the Met Office and the IPCC process. But I was able to put a whole section on his Christian faith at the end. He was one of the people instrumental in setting up the North Oxford Overseas Centre, which some of you may know about. Some of you may benefit from, I don't know. So I wanted to finish on that note, because we should give thanks to people like him who've laboured away for decades on our behalf. And I'll just finish with this picture of the Earth from the last space shuttle flight before they retired it, just to remind us that we live in that very thin blue zone, actually only a part of that blue zone, which is the atmosphere around the Earth in the background, that arc in the background. So what we do with it really does matter. Thanks very much.
Bob, thank you very much for speaking. That was fantastic, and I love the thought of there being volcanoes and the new creation and them being safe. You can go up reasonably close to look at them, so thank you very much indeed. We're going to take a break now for a few minutes, and there'll be a chance for us to chat to the people around us. And we're going to put a QR code up, and that will take you through to Slido, and you'll be able to submit some questions for our Q&A. And we'll do a combination of questions from the floor and questions from Slido, and we'll start that in a few minutes. Okay, everyone, let's got some good questions that have come in, so please feel free to send some more in. Bob, let's start with this one. How do we strike a balance between environmental conservation and development, especially for the majority world or poorer contexts?
Yeah. Am I on now? Yes, great. Yeah, there's all sorts of things. I usually refrain from saying what individuals should do, because it's going to be different for everybody. But I think there is good evidence that actually looking after your soil that you're growing your crops in is actually a good thing, because it's more likely to be useful in the future. And we all know what happened with the Dust Bowl of the 1930s in North America. I mean, it turns out that of the world's possible soils for agriculture, we've destroyed about a third of it, we're using about a third of it, and we've got about a third left. So drawing that balance is, I think we can find ways to do agriculture, say, and to help development of poorer places in ways which are ecologically sound and probably better than pouring loads of pesticides and things on. And well, if you've seen the David Attenborough series, Wild Isles, he's talked about that a bit there. And I think there's a real place for Christians in rich countries who should feel responsible for the consequences of their actions, to help people in places affected, say, by droughts, to find ways of micro-irrigation so the water will get to the roots and not all evaporate again. Personally, I think genetic engineering of crops is a good thing if it can make them more robust against drought, but I know different people have different views on that. So I think there's quite a lot we can do, even using indigenous knowledge, because we've often thrown that away. We're better as scientists than they are, but actually they knew things that we don't know. And actually, I won't go on forever, but I'll give you one example of this. When the tsunami happened in Indonesia, if you remember that, there was an island called Simeulue, which was just offshore the epicenter, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed by the initial tsunami. So they didn't get to this island for a week. But when they fetched up to see what they could salvage, they found everybody perfectly happy, cooking their meals and so on. Quite a lot of the houses near the sea had been wiped out, but it seems that nobody was killed. And they said, how on earth did you survive this massive tsunami when you're so close? And they said, oh, our grandparents used to tell us about one in 1947, and they said, if you ever see the sea go out, you run up the hill. That's all. So they saw the sea go up, and they ran up the hill, and they all survived, right? And all the tourists sitting on the coastline there in their hotels didn't know that. Sea went out, they actually went out and said, oh, that's interesting, and pick you up bits and then got drowned. So I think there is local knowledge as well, which we, in our arrogance, have ignored, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. I know you just said you don't want to be too prescriptive about what we can do, but often we feel, we see the facts, we hear presentations, and often we feel powerless. Do you have practical suggestions for what difference can I make?
Yeah. One thing I think that Christians particularly, but everybody actually forget, is that there's Christians in every single part of the world. There's parishes in every square inch of Britain. And we are extremely powerful force if we choose to be so we can lobby our members of parliament. Now, members of parliament and elected officials find it really hard to do things which are going to have payback in decades, but that's what we've got to do now. And if we say, but one thing they really do care about is getting re-elected, right, every 4 years or whatever. So if we say, what's your policy on reducing greenhouse gases in Britain, on net zero or whatever, and don't elect them if they don't have a decent policy. We're extremely powerful. We're lucky because we live in a democracy. So using that power is a good thing to do. As I said earlier, many of us, many Christians have links with people in the majority world, the low-income world, who are affected by these things particularly hard, and they're low income, so they can't respond very easily. And we should therefore lobby on behalf of them. We should give money to help them to adapt to the changes we've caused. And of course we can mitigate what we do. We can insulate our houses better and so on. I always try to offset the carbon I produce by driving every year, by looking at how many miles I've driven, and then usually give money not to plant trees but to help use a Christian organisation to work in Africa to help adapt to climate change. So that sort of thing we can do. If the world was an equitable place, we would each have an allowance of 1.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide. That would be equally spread amongst everybody. It is impossible to live in Britain today on 1.5 kilograms, tonnes of carbon dioxide, unless you live in a cave and you're a hermit and you just eat potatoes or something. So I think what we have to do then, if we want to interact with society, we just have to accept that, and we have to pay for the consequences of our actions, because all our actions have consequences. And I think that's a reasonable way to do it, wherever you are, whatever your lifestyle is, just to make sure that you try and pay for the consequence of what you've done, pay back for the carbon you've burnt in your car or whatever. So that's a practical thing.
And thinking that's in terms of individuals. What about a local church? How could it engage in a more ecological way?
Yes, one of the problems with churches is, they have enormous high roofs and it's really hard to heat them, isn't it? And if we don't have warm churches, we're not very welcoming. So I think that's a real problem. I think one of the interesting things is that most churches face east, west, so they have a lovely south-facing roof you could put solar panels on. And at least in many dioceses, they've given you freedom from faculty. If you get into church politics, you need a faculty to change anything. But they'll let you put solar panels up. Why don't we put solar panels up? If we're doing new builds, we can obviously insulate buildings. one of the problems in Britain is that our housing stock is so old and it's so expensive to convert that you can't really do it to as good a standard as you'd like. But if you're doing new build, you certainly can. So I know I have friends with new houses that they hardly use any electricity at all. It's almost, they have some solar panels, they hardly pay anything. So it's good for your pocket as well, actually, as well as good for the climate. There are things called green churches, aren't there? I don't know if you're involved in that. I think evangelicals have often been so concerned with salvation, personal salvation, that they forgot the community aspect of Christian living. I'm not saying that's the case here, because I know you do a lot of work in communities, but many church people have. I once got a scrawled note to me saying, never mind the earth, people need saving. Well, people live on the earth, and people will live embodied lives in the future. So you need to do both, really. You want to tell them the gospel and show practicalities in the way that you behave in this world that sort of model that. So, as I say, it's different for every individual and every circumstance, but I think it should be on the agenda to think about, at least.
Thank you. You mentioned about engaging politicians. Question here, should Christians be involved in climate protests? And if so, at what level? Is it enough of a crisis to break the law, or should we submit to authorities?
Well, Jesus said a few things about this, didn't he? About giving to Caesar what was Caesar's. And you should obey authorities because they're by God's sovereign will, however much you must disagree with their politics or whatever. And you should only perhaps disobey them if it goes directly against gospel imperatives. Yeah, we should obey them as far as we can. What was the rest of the question? Should we?
I think it was about, should we break the law or submit?
Yes,
At what kind of level should we protest?
Okay, there is an organisation, Extinction Rebellion, which I think does illegal things, and I don't think that's good, because people just turn off. There's an XXR, apparently, a Christian Extinction Rebellion that I don't know much about, but I met somebody from it once who was very engaged with it, and he was more concerned with educating people to the issues, much like we're doing tonight. But I can't see that this issue means you should break the law over it, and I think it's very disrespectful to people to cross the Dartford crossing, which they did one day when we were trying to drive back home from looking after our grandchildren in South London, because they chained themselves to the Dartford crossing. Actually, they've just got a prison sentence, haven't they, this last day or two I saw for that. So I don't see the point of that, and I think Christians would bring Christianity into disrepute if they did that. So no, I don't think we should do that. But by all means, talk about it, and talk about it in the context of a Christian belief in this world as not the end of all things, but the beginning of all things, actually.
Great. We'll take questions from the floor in a moment. At the end of, halfway through your presentation, at the end of the section on the facts, you spoke about social justice being a key reason for engaging with environmental issues with climate change. And then you moved on. Could you say a little bit more on that motivation?
Yes, well, as I said, it's pretty clear that the climate change has been caused primarily by the rich nations burning fossil fuels, and it's people that didn't benefit from the wealth creation that allowed who are suffering the consequences. So I think there are big social issues there that we should be aware of and we should do something about. And I've talked already about, I think giving aid to Christian organizations that are working in areas to help farmers become sustainable, to help them cope with more extremes of weather and so on, maybe to find crops that will be more resilient in those circumstances, are the sort of thing we should be doing from a scientific perspective at least. And obviously giving aid. One of the things that one of the previous COPs decided to do was that they would give $100 million or $100 billion, I forget, it must be $100 billion, to the poorer nations to help recompense. And actually, when you look at what's actually happened, nobody has done that. No country has done it. except I think for Finland did give their share. Britain didn't, and I think one of the sadnesses I find is that the government recently decreased the amount. Remember, we pledged years and years ago internationally to give 0.7% of our GDP to overseas aid, and recently that was cut back to 0.5%. This is 0.7p in the pound, you know. That would buy you one latte a month or something. And we've cut back on that. And even a lot of that aid was linked to British companies. So I'm extremely embarrassed by being a British Christian that we've done that to people who need it more than us. Now, Christians are pretty good about realizing that the wealth they have comes from God ultimately and using it for the common good. And I think we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. And I've said this before in audiences that I sometimes have this thought that, you know, I might meet somebody from sub-Saharan Africa, a Christian there, in the new creation, who comes up to me and says to Bob, I'm so pleased to meet you. We were praying for you in that horrible situation in Britain with all that secularism. And there's me thinking, what did I do for you? You know, when you were malnourished and you couldn't get enough food and so on. So there are real issues of justice, I think. And I think we are the people who have plenty and will have to answer for it, really, rightly so, I think. What did we do with that? So it's not just our material wealth, but also, you know, the spiritual wealth we have in Britain, which is immense. Just look around the churches in Oxford and Cambridge. Immense spiritual resources. So, yeah, we should be accountable, and I think we sometimes get so locked into our problems that actually the latte was a bit cold when I got it, you know, that we forget these issues.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to the floor. If you've got a question, put a hand up, David. Shout it out.
Thank you so much for the talk. Very illuminating. You mentioned the dialogue between science and Christianity, and you also mentioned evangelicals here. Do you think that the crisis can help us also enter into dialogue with different traditions within Christianity? In the sense that, what I'm saying is, as an evangelical, many times I see that evangelical Christians have started later to react to these, whereas other traditions, I'm thinking, for example, the Eastern Orthodox tradition is much more aware of the places creation has.
Yeah, did you hear that? Is this a chance for evangelical Christians to get into dialogue with other faith traditions? Because, and you're exactly right, the Greek Orthodox Church has been at the forefront of environmental issues, environmental care, in a way that often we haven't. And as I said earlier, I think sometimes we're so concerned with saving souls that we forget that we're saving holistic people. They're not just souls, they're bodies and souls as a whole. And, you know, it's no good saving somebody living in poverty and as you see around Cambridge, in a sleeping bag in the entrance to Sainsbury's overnight, saying, that's all right, brother, you know, you'll be saved if you agree to this confession of faith, without giving them some food and some shelter and I think I'm slightly embarrassed that, you know, the whole environmental agenda was driven by sort of tree huggers and so on. And you thought, oh, I don't want to be a tree hugger. And we, as you said, came very late to the party, but it's not too late. So I think it is a good opportunity to meet with other groups of people with similar concerns, and maybe to bring into why we think we should care for creation, because it is God's creation, because there is a future for it, because we're commanded to look after it. So I think it's a really good opportunity actually to talk to people. And maybe just as COVID, I think, brought up discussions about death, didn't it? I don't know if that was your experience, but, you know, people were really frightened of dying. And so here's an opportunity to talk about death. You know, why are you not frightened of dying? Because there's something better awaiting us. You know, I think we can talk to people who are quite rightly concerned about environmental degradation and so on, but without any basis on which to go forward without any hope, really. Here is a real opportunity. So I think you're exactly right. It is a real opportunity to join with others and discuss these things and actually just naturally to bring in the good news that we have, because it is good news.
Good. Thank you. Another question? Suzanne?
You mentioned that protesting could bring Christians into disrepute. There's the other side of the coin as well. So a lot of Christians, evangelical Christians, maybe deny climate change, or how should we interact with those churches? Should we be public to say we disagree with this, or should we be quietly ignoring it, or what's the right response?
Yes, I think the issue, I think most people in Britain would say, yeah, well, there is climate change, but most of them would say, well, I'm just a small cog in the wheel, so I'm not sure what I can do. I think it's a much bigger problem in North America, and it's very weird, isn't it, that it should be so, but North America, I can say this because my son is American, right, he was born in America, so, but they do have very weird views on some things. I've always thought that Republicans are pro-life at birth and pro-death at the death sentence, and Democrats are the reverse. And why should a political view bring that out, you know? So how should we react to them? For most such situations, I find, just my personal thing that I find when you're in sort of conflict things, is just to get on and model living as best you can as a Christian. Now we're all flawed and we all do it less well than we should, but and that is much more powerful witness than haranguing somebody, because you'll never change their mind anyway. If they just see how you just practically get on, then I know of people who have been converted that way. In fact, we're just publishing a book from the Faraday Institute called Converted by Dawkins, actually. These are students of Dawkins who heard him and became Christians. So look out for this book.
Good, thank you. Another question from the floor. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. About food. These things are always much more complicated than a black and white thing. So I was just, we've got a little 2-year-old granddaughter and she loves raspberries, and we bought her some raspberries from Co-op last week, and I looked at it and thought, made in Morocco, you know. But actually, if we stopped buying raspberries from Morocco or roses from Kenya, it would devastate people's lives there, where thousands of people rely on that. And actually, I suspect that flying lightweight things like raspberries and roses, maybe the benefit in aid to them outweighs the ridiculousness of flying roses from Kenya to England. So, you know, you have to make personal decisions on that. I think consciously eating more vegetarian food, even if you're not vegetarian, is probably a good idea, and it's probably healthier for you anyway, actually. So I think that's a good idea. Eating locally, if you can, is a good idea. Not wasting food. I mean, they say that 1/3 of all food that's bought is wasted. And I know supermarkets, they're taking tiny little baby steps about this, aren't they? I noticed we had some apples, which we bought from Waitrose, I think. And it said, we've no longer put a use-by date on it. Eat it if it looks okay. And, you know, that's common sense, isn't it? Yeah, eat if it's okay. We pretty soon know if it's not. So I think being sensible about food, not eating too much food, you know. Obesity is a real problem here, isn't it? Growing so in Britain. And being mindful of what you eat, I think. I think the big thing is probably moving away from red meats a little bit, eating chicken. Apparently eating ostrich is very good for some reason. But I never have, actually.
It's delicious. Ostrich is delicious. I perfected a number of sauces to go with ostrich when we lived in South
I
Africa.
don't think they produce much methane. I think that's the reason.
A final question from the floor.
Behind the pillar.
Yep.
Yeah, no, it's difficult. That's why I said it's not black and white, is it? There are complicated things. But, I mean, Jesus clearly enjoyed feasts now and then, and I think that was right. He also clearly went pretty hungry sometimes too, as did Paul. I think it's really interesting. Paul lists all the things he'd suffered. You know, he suffered famines and flooding and shipwreck and being beaten and thrown out of the town, all sorts of things. But he said, in spite of all that, I give glory to God, you know, because God is sovereign over this. And I think God is sovereign over it. So, yeah, don't get too angsty about it. But it is, you know, it makes sense to think about these things. And maybe if you don't need avocados for your recipe in midwinter, you know, maybe you can put something else in instead. But as I say, it's not completely trivial, because a lot of people that are growing this in foreign countries, it's their livelihoods. And if we just abruptly said, no, I'm not going to use that, you know, they would suffer much more than we would, of course, because it's their livelihoods. So, yeah, I think we need to learn from each other. It's probably good to chat to, you know, people in your local faith group, whether it's a home group or Christian Union or whatever it is. I think it can be helpful, actually, to see how other people navigate that. It's actually one of the reasons I love reading Christian biographies, because you see people navigating, how did they navigate these issues, which maybe I've not come across all of them, but some of them I have, and it's just helpful to know. But, you know, we are living in a world which God said is very good. It's a world that he loved to give us fruitfulness. He loves us to have feasts from time to time, you know, and he loves us to enjoy the fruits of the world. So I think that's a proper thing as well. And as you say, remembering you're a Christian and a redeemed child of God is really helpful in that, because that hopefully will take the guilt away, but just make you more mindful of when you're making these decisions, and many other decisions, which are equally part of being a Christian, aren't they? Navigating a Christian. But of course, we do live in a fallen world, and these things are never going to be easy until Christ comes again. I know, the last thing I'll say is my wife and I, when we're going through a particular difficult time for whatever reason, things are, you know, struggling with things, we say, oh, come Lord Jesus, and preferably tonight. Thanks.
Bob, thank you very much indeed for coming over and for speaking to us this evening. We've hugely appreciated what you've said. Thank you very much indeed. Let's give him a round of applause. Bob has written a number of books. We've got two of them with us tonight. This one here, Creation in Crisis, is a little bit older, and it's available for £2 tonight in the bookstall at the back. And then we've got another one, Who is to Blame? Disasters, Nature and Acts of God. That one's £7, and again, there are copies at the back. So do have a look there. We've got other books as well on environmental issues. And thank you very much for coming tonight, and especially if you're a guest or a visitor here tonight.
And those are free. Pick those up. It's John Houghton.
Those are free. And if you're a guest or a visitor, thank you very much for joining us here at St. Ebbe's tonight. It's been great to have you with us. Let's continue to discuss and to chat about these things and to engage with each other. But thank you very much for coming, and have a good evening.